guys, it's Casera, and today I'm going to be doing my book talk for the Hunger Games Trilogy by Suzanne Collins. So as most of you guys probably know, the Hunger Games Trilogy has 3 books in it. The first book is The Hunger Games, book 2 is Catching Fire, and book 3 is Mockingjay. So this is obviously a very popular series, especially because of the movies that came out. But I actually read the series before it was super popular. Like, I read it, I want to say in high school when it first came out. I bought the series and read it because Suzanne Collins was an author that I really enjoyed and I wanted to read more of her books. I really loved The Hunger Games the first time around. The first book in the series I absolutely loved, and I was super excited to move on to the second book in the series. And then I read Catching Fire, and I have to say I was a little disappointed in it. I almost felt like it was a redo of The Hunger Games, just not as well done. And then lastly, I read Mockingjay, and I was really disappointed by Mockingjay. So originally, the way I rated these books, I gave Mockingjay 2 stars, Catching Fire 4 stars, and The Hunger Games 5 stars. That being said, I've reread it several times since then, and in my most recent reread, I feel like I had a completely different outlook of the series as a whole than when I did when I was a teenager. So I'm gonna kind of go through how that works, but I'm also gonna be talking about like the 4 things that I typically talk about when I do like reviews, and that's character, plot, world building, and writing style. But before we get into all of that, this book talk is going to be filled with spoilers. So if you have not read the series, first of all, please go read the series. It's fantastic. There's a reason it's as popular as it is, and then come back and you can watch this book talk. But first of all, we're gonna talk about character. And I think the characters are what really make this series amazing, because Katniss is a character, she's such a strong female character while at the same time not being like over the top, if you know what I mean. She has a very relatable personality, and the way the characterization is done, I absolutely love. Like the first chapter, as I was rereading it this time around, I wanted to annotate it because I can just see the sort of things that were being portrayed as Katniss as a character. Specifically, the thing I remember at the very beginning was Katniss with the cat. She mentioned that the cat hates her, and it was probably because she tried to strangle him this one time. And it was just like, oh my gosh, Katniss, you can't just say something like that. No one kills cats. But she has really good reasoning behind it because, you know, they are very poor. They don't have food on their table. They can't afford to feed this cat. Obviously, she didn't actually end up killing the cat, and they come to an understanding, sort of. But I really enjoyed like those aspects of it where Katniss's survival instincts kind of override what, you know, like a typical like good person would do necessarily, and I enjoyed that aspect of her character and the way that it was portrayed as well. And then of course we have Katniss's sister Primrose, which this time around when I was reading the first book, The Hunger Games, I was just so emotional reading those first 2 chapters, and I didn't really understand why I was that emotional until I got to the end. And it's because of Katniss's relationship with her sister. In that most iconic moment where Katniss volunteers as tribute, like she's doing this because she loves her sister. She's a survivor. She does everything to stay alive, and yet she's putting herself in literally her worst nightmare in order to save her sister. And that just got me so emotional this time around. Like the first time around, I did not care. And even in most of my subsequent rereads, I did not care. But this time around, for some reason, I was just feeling very nostalgic or whatever it was, but that just hit me really hard. And I think part of it is because this whole thing kind of started when Katniss volunteered as tribute, and it was kind of for nothing, if you guys remember what happens at the end of Mockingjay, which I will get to during the plot section. But like it almost felt like it was pointless, which is not the sort of thing you normally get from a YA novel. Like this is more the sort of thing you would get from like a post World War II adult historical fiction, or you know, something like that. That's where you would get the whole like pointlessness of war sort of feel to it. But I got that from the Hunger Games in just a few chapters. I mean, it wouldn't have been in just a few chapters because you would have had to have read the series before in order to understand the importance of that moment. But at the same time, I was so emotional, like so emotional. So before I move on from character, we should probably talk about the elephant in the room, which is Peeta and Gale. So the whole love triangle, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I was super into it when I read it the first time. The love triangle was like my main reason for reading this series. This time around, I did not care for it at all. Like, I didn't even really pay attention to the love triangle. Mind you, I've always been Team Gale, and that's probably why I don't care as much for the love triangle upon reread, because we know what happens, right? So I'm gonna start with Gale. He is that best friend figure, right? But he also has a pretty strong personality. What surprises me about both Peeta and Gale are how similar they are, because Gale is pretty outspoken about how against the Capitol he is, and then Peeta, he has these moments where it'll show that he's against the Capitol. The first one I think is in the Hunger Games, where they're on the roof of the building that they're staying in the Capitol, and he and Katniss are talking, and he says he wants to die as himself, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but Katniss doesn't really get it at the time. But it is sort of a rebellion against the Capitol also, even though he's not as outspoken as Gale is in that aspect, which Katniss is quite different to both of them in that aspect, because she just wants to survive. She doesn't want to fight back against all of that. She's kind of forced to eventually, obviously, but I enjoy that comparison there. The other part that I thought was really interesting, and this is one of the only times where I'll talk about Mockingjay in a very positive light. There's one scene between Peeta and Gale in Mockingjay that I absolutely love, and Katniss is like hearing the scene of Peeta and Gale talking while she's supposed to be asleep, and I just really loved that scene. Like, there wasn't a whole lot of substance to it, but just the way that it was done, I really enjoyed it, because you can kind of see that they're both like really great guys, because they're not angry at the other one for any reason, which it would be very easy for them to be angry at each other. Like, it would be very easy for that, but they're not petty in that way. They understand that they're working for the same goals, even though that they're at odds with each other. So I really enjoyed that scene also, and I felt like it showed a lot for both of their characters. And even though I'm Team Gale, I completely understand why Katniss chose Peeta. Like, I completely understand. It makes sense in my head, especially with what happened at the end with Prim and the bombs and all of that. Like, at that point, you know Katniss wasn't gonna choose Gale. I just wish she had chose Peeta before going into all of that, if you know what I mean. Because of the way that was done, that part of it felt very anticlimactic, especially the first time around, and that's probably why I originally gave this book a 2-star, because I just felt like the love triangle didn't resolve in a satisfying way, which I still believe. I don't think the love triangle resolved in a satisfying way, but I'm way more okay with it now than I was back then, just because I don't care about the love triangle as much now. Like, I just don't. So yeah, there are a few more characters I should mention really quick, just because they are great characters, and we first kind of get to see them in Catching Fire. So first of all, Finnick is amazing. I absolutely love him, and just like the way all of the other champions treat Katniss when they like first meet her, I just absolutely love that. It was fantastically done. And Finnick, of course, is one of the main characters that like teases her and stuff, which I absolutely love. That being said, his overall story arc I loved. Like, I loved his story arc, everything that happened with him, and what his life actually was. I really wish we could have gotten a story from Finnick's point of view, because I feel like he would have had a very interesting backstory. Not necessarily his first Hunger Games, but like what happened after that, I think could have been incredibly interesting, and I really enjoy him as a character. The other one that I totally didn't mention that I really should have is Haymitch. Haymitch is a fantastic character. I really like that he's not like your typical good character. Like, I don't think really any characters in this series, except for maybe Prim and Rue, are like your typical like really good, sweet characters. But Haymitch is one of those characters. He's a very great character, because he's not the type of person that like if you met him, you wouldn't like him. I don't think anyone would like him, at least in a first impression sort of sense, because I mean, he's a drunk and he's rude and mean, but he's also incredibly smart and clever, and he fights for Katniss even when she won't fight for herself. I really love that about him. I forgot to mention President Snow. So President Snow is a really great character, and I did not realize this until this reread. I absolutely love President Snow as a character. He's obviously an antagonist, but especially you can see it more so in Mockingjay, that he's not all evil. With President Snow, I feel like you get like sort of hints and clues as to his backstory, that he wasn't always the horrible person that he is in this trilogy, especially in Mockingjay. I feel like you get a little bit of that, especially the scene in the greenhouse where Katniss goes to get a flower and she finds President Snow is in the greenhouse. That's because where he's being held is in the greenhouse. And the conversation that they have, like, he didn't have to tell her the things that he did. Obviously, he was manipulating her when he did that, but at the same time, he almost did her a kindness as well. So, I don't know. President Snow is one of those great characters that I really feel like I'm excited to learn more about, because the new book, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, is coming out really soon, and I'm really excited for it, having done this reread. Like, I'm so pumped for it. Like, I feel like the Hunger Games trilogy just gives you interesting insights into President Snow, even though, like, he's obviously a terrible person, and it will be very interesting to see how he became the person that he is. So now we're gonna move on to plot. So I'm gonna start with the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games, I think, is a very well plotted out book. Like, I think it was done really well, and I think the fact that it's in first person point of view works really well for this book, because you have Katniss, who is a strong character, who does really well, and you kind of have this really good structure of an intro and then entering into the games. And you have it like in multiple parts, where you have them in District 12, in the Capitol, and then in the actual arena. And then of course in the arena you have it where Katniss is on her own, and then there's that rule change, and she goes and finds Peeta because they can win together. And then all of these crazy things happen. There's this huge finale. It's really great. And then the rule changes again. And the whole twist with the berries. It was fantastically plotted. I absolutely loved every second of this plot. I also think it's written in a way that is just so fast-paced and fun, and I really, really enjoy that. For me, The Hunger Games is almost like a perfect book plot-wise. Like, it's plotted perfectly. And then we have Catching Fire. And Catching Fire is not perfect. Catching Fire is broken up into 3 parts. You have the very beginning part, which is when they're on their victory tour. Then you have the middle part, which is when they're in District 12 and they're getting ready for the wedding and all of that. And then there's the big announcement that there's the 75th annual Hunger Games. It's a quarter quell, and the tributes are going to be chosen from the victors. So of course that means Katniss is going back into the Hunger Games. And that's kind of where I start having problems with this series. So up until that point, I absolutely love this series. But when we get to that point, we realize, oh, so it's just gonna be another Hunger Games again. And even like the next section where we have, you know, our characters in the Capitol and they're getting ready for the arena and they're not yet in the arena, so they're like meeting the other tributes and stuff like that. I enjoyed all of that. It's just once they get into the arena, I got so bored. It's not that things aren't happening. There's tons of action happening, but it seems almost like action without a purpose, if you know what I mean. Like in the first one, it was very much like survival instincts kicking in for Katniss and just trying to survive. In this one, survival is not really a thing anymore. Katniss is not trying to survive. She's trying to make sure Peeta survives. But at the same time, it feels almost false because the stakes were a lot higher before they went into the arena, if you know what I mean, because of this whole rebellion thing that was kind of brewing throughout the story. It almost felt like the stakes dropped a little bit when they went into the arena, and now it's back to, you know, survival of the fittest. So I didn't enjoy that part of it. Also, this is when I feel like the point of view works against the story. I really wished that we could have gotten some points of views other than Katniss, especially when she's in the arena, because like she doesn't know what's going on outside. There's a lot going on outside during that time. There's a lot happening specifically in District 12 at that time. So I really wish we could have got Gale's point of view or something during the time, or Prim's point of view, anyone really that is in District 12. I felt like that could have been a really interesting part of the story that we just didn't get because we were in Katniss's head. And Katniss is over here just trying to keep Peeta alive, doing kind of what feels pointless when what I really cared about was what's going on with this rebellion, if you know what I mean. So I didn't enjoy that aspect of it as much. I still enjoyed the first like 3/4 of this book, mind you. I really loved the first 3/4 of this book, but that last quarter, I just felt like a lot happened, especially towards the end. We got a lot more information about what was happening, but up until that point, there's a lot that happens off the page that I didn't enjoy that aspect of it. And then we have Mockingjay. And Mockingjay is where all good stories go to die. No, in all seriousness, Mockingjay's not terrible. I think the first 3/4 of this book is like the opposite to Catching Fire. Like the first 3/4 of this book I found incredibly boring. And then the last quarter was good. Not great, not amazing, but good. And I think it was satisfying enough that I enjoyed the ending. Like for the rebellion, like the rebellion ending I enjoyed. The love triangle subplot, like I mentioned, I thought was not very satisfying just in the way that it was done. The rebellion ending I think was done really well. So mind you, it's not any one thing that I didn't like about the first 3/4 of this book. Like I like the setting, like District 13 is a very interesting setting in like a nuclear underground bunker. I think that's a very interesting setting and I enjoyed that aspect of it. I like the culture of District 13 and how everything is like so scarce that you throw away a piece of paper and people freak out. Like I liked all of that. I just found it incredibly boring. Like I felt like the pace did not keep up the way the pace of the previous books kept up. It got a lot more political, which I enjoyed actually. I think that's part of the reason why I enjoyed it more now than when I first read it, because now I personally love good politics in fiction in a way that I didn't care for it as much back then. So I like that it got political and there was a complexity to that political stuff that was going on, but I felt like this book could have really benefited from, again, having multiple points of view, because I felt like Peeta's point of view would have been really interesting in this book, especially like in the first half. I think Gale would have had an interesting point of view as well, even though you can get most of what Gale's going on with Katniss's point of view. And the other one that I think could have been really good is Prim's point of view, because at the very end of this book, obviously we know Katniss is almost done. The capital is ready to surrender, and there is this pen of children, right? Of capital children that are sitting outside of the building, and this hovercraft comes and drops all these packages on those children, and the children go to grab the packages and they explode. At least half of them explode. So they kill a bunch of children, and then you have all of these medical workers that go in and save those children, and then the other half of the packages explode, and of course Katniss is there and she sees that her sister Prim was one of the medical workers. And that moment, first of all, I don't think the way it was written was done very well, just because you don't get a solid, clear understanding of what happened, because Katniss kind of just shuts down and everything from her point of view after that is kind of in this haze. But that moment, just thinking of it overall, is very powerful, partially because it's Prim and because this whole thing started because Katniss didn't want Prim to die, but also partially because of the way that she died. Because one, later on we find out from President Snow that he didn't have a hovercraft, so the only persons that could have dropped those bombs were District 13. And there's also the method used, which of course was bombing and then waiting for people to arrive to help, and then bombing again, which was Gale's strategy that he used earlier on in the story. So just putting all of those little threads together, I really love how that was done from an objective perspective. From an objective perspective, I completely understand how that was done, and I really, really loved it. From a personal feelings perspective, I hate it so much. One, because I love Gale and I really wish that that just didn't happen. I just wish that could have gone away. Also because of Prim. Obviously, you don't get to know Prim as well as you get to know Katniss, but just their relationship and how much Katniss would sacrifice for her sister, like that was just devastating to me. And like I said, that I was really emotional this read through because of that, and because knowing what was going to happen at that ending. And then the very last bit where Katniss is going to kill President Snow and she kills President Coin instead. I thought that was brilliant. I think that is what redeemed this book in my eyes. Like if it wasn't for that section, I think I would have still left it at a 2-star, just because the first 3/4 are just so bad. But that ending was just so poignant that I absolutely loved it. Like I loved every second of that ending. Like from the moment we have those bombs drop on the children all the way until Katniss kills President Coin, which is the president of District 13. I just think that part was perfectly done, and I love the way that was done. I do think this book has a lot of problems leading up to that I didn't enjoy as much, but I really, really loved that part. So now we're gonna talk about world building. So I think this series does such a great job at world building because, of course, first of all, you have the Hunger Games in which you have the districts and you have the capital, and I absolutely love it. One, I love that the capital is called the capital, just because it feels very much like capitalism, because you have all of these people in one place who are very rich and they're very privileged and they have pretty much everything you could possibly want. And then you have the districts where people work really hard and they generally don't have enough to feed their families. Especially in District 12, some of the districts maybe have a little bit more necessities than others, which is like typical of these types of situations. So I felt like it really does a good job of reflecting everyday life in a metaphorical sense, if you understand what I mean. So I enjoyed that aspect of it, and also how technology is brought into this, because you have things like hovercrafts and genetically modified like plants and animals, and of course everything that happens in the actual Hunger Games arenas is very well done and very fantastic, which I enjoyed. Then we go into Catching Fire, and I like how we get to see like the different districts. It just like expands the world a lot, and I enjoyed that aspect of it, especially the way they talk about like the imports and exports of the districts, how they use the bread to kind of describe each of the different districts' works. I think that was a very interesting and unique way of talking about like different cultures and things. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. And then we have the District 13 section, which is of course an underground bunker, and just their culture is really interesting, how like it's so scarce. I also really love like comparing District 13 with the capital, just because District 13 feels almost communistic to me in a sense, because you have like a certain amount of resources and you have to spread them among the population, and everything is just so regulated, as opposed to the capital, which is like there's an overabundance of stuff for these one small group of people while everyone else kind of suffers. And that's not necessarily distributed by who is working the most, but who is like the smartest in the way that they get things. Even like with the victors, right? They do rise from the bottom, but they do it by killing a bunch of other people. And obviously, like real life entrepreneurs don't kill a bunch of people to get to the top and become millionaires, but you understand what I'm talking about, right? For the most part, there's the really rich people, and then there's a few people that can rise from the bottom, but the majority of the people who are working really hard to become rich never actually get there. I like how that world building kind of is a metaphor for how our world works, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And because of that association, it makes the story feel a little bit more real to me. And lastly, we're going to talk about writing style, and I think I put hints and clues throughout this book talk of how I felt about the writing style, because like I mentioned, I think the first book was just so perfectly plotted, and I felt like the way the author did the characterization, especially in the beginning with Katniss, and just the sort of things she brought up, was really, really well done. I think the pacing of the series is fantastic. It keeps you reading throughout the entire series. It still somehow brings out depth and emotion that you're not really expecting going into the series to start with. So I enjoy that aspect of it. My only real complaints writing style wise come from Mockingjay, because I don't think that the love triangle had as satisfying of an ending as I wanted it to. I just feel like there were ways to make that love triangle a little bit more satisfying. And I also feel like, especially the third book, but also partially the second book, Catching Fire, I think could have really benefited from having point of views outside of Katniss, because there was a lot going on outside of Katniss's scope that was really interesting and brought a lot of complexity to the story that we just didn't get because we were kind of stuck in Katniss's head. So I feel like this is a very long video, but overall, I absolutely love this series. It's one of my favorite of all times, especially this first book. This first book in the series is absolutely one of my favorites of all time. If you guys have read the series, hopefully you have, if you've gotten to this point of the video, because I had a lot of spoilers in there, but if you've read this, let me know down in the comments what you guys think of the series, because I absolutely love it, and I hope that you guys did too, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I post videos every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, so consider subscribing. I also post bonus videos if you want to be notified as soon as I upload. You can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.